When CRPGs or RPGs in general get brought up, we hear some obvious names: Obsidian, BioWare, or Bethesda. If you're a huge fan, you might hear Troika Games, Interplay, or Surtech. And if you're strictly a fan of JRPGs, you might hear Square Enix, Atlas, or Nintendo. Forgive me, I don't know much about JRPGs, but for every company with some name recognition, there are studios that go under the radar, and that's unfortunate. Today's video is about one of those studios, Spiderweb Software.
Hello, I am indie game developer and living legend, Jeff Vogel. 20 years ago, I had a dream that I would spend my life in my basement, creating fantasy worlds and imaginary dungeons. Dungeons full of monsters for you to beat up and steal their money.
Spiderweb Software is a two-person operation. It's run by Jeff Vogel and his wife. Jeff Vogel describes himself as a humble toy maker, and I'll leave links to some recent interviews he did. They're quite insightful. The unique thing about this company is that for over 20 years, Jeff has made some impressive CRPGs all by himself. He does hire some freelancers for art and some things like that, but other than that, it's a one-man team. Yes, a one-man team created over 15 CRPGs in the past 24 years. Spiderweb Software is known for releasing deep, rich, long RPGs with a bunch of dialogue and text for you to read. They're not known for magnificent graphics or sound design. In fact, a lot of Spiderweb Software games have little sound design, barely any music, and terrible graphics. There are environmental sounds and small things like that, but other than that, it's bare bones. Even in their new releases like Avedon, they don't have much sound design, but if you ignore their games because of that, you're missing out. And just to repeat myself, Jeff has been making games for almost 25 years, since the times of that annoying fucking sound you hear when you had to use dial-up. You know what I'm talking about, the ones that sounds like fucking Armageddon's coming when you just try to log online. I'm glad I didn't have to deal with that, because by the time I had internet, thankfully I didn't have to get dial-up. But that's how long he's been making games, since DOSBox, shareware, and dial-up since those days. Remember the 90s? Shareware was before my time, but the best way I can explain it is, before the internet was a big deal, and even before we started getting Angel Fire pages and GeoCity pages. Remember those things? Yeah, I think they existed around the early 2000s and late 90s. It looks like one of those things a second grader can make in MS Paint nowadays. Not knocking it, that's just the way it was back then. But seriously, some of those websites look goofy as fuck. And it's nostalgic even though I didn't even know where the fuck I was at that time because I was so young. By the way, there's an old Angel Fire site from 1997 that's still around, and it was made by a cult. You can even email them and one of the cult members still responds 20 years later. It's fucking weird. But back to the fucking video, I'm getting off topic. Now, what people used to do back in the day to sell their games, if you didn't have a big company or big publishing behind you, you had to make money. So what did you do? You released a demo, you put it out there, and hopefully by word of mouth, or maybe even the earliest days of the internet, people could spread it around. And with those tools, developers would release 1/3 of their games or even half of their games as a demo. And that's how you got people hooked. They would play the game, and right when they're getting into it, the demo would end. And they would want to beat it, so you would give them information on how to get the game. Send money here, and you'll get your game. And it worked for a lot of people. If word of mouth could spread, or the earliest days of the internet, they could spread it around through some message boards, you could make a lot of money. Just ask the people who made Doom. That was released as shareware and it was a fucking success. That's how Jeff Vogel made his money in the earliest days of the internet. That's what he had to do to survive as an independent company, a two-person operation. Another way they promoted themselves was through demo disc, and 24 years later, he's still making games. Not bad for a person that went to grad school for mathematics and ended up hating it. His interview with GeekWire is very revealing, so I would check that out. And by the way, I don't blame you, Jeff. Fuck math. Seriously, have you seen some of those math problems those grad students have to solve? It looks like you're reading the Dead Sea Scrolls or hieroglyphics or some shit like that. Fuck that. Now, for Spiderweb Software, it all started with 1995's Exile Escape from the Pit. Now, just a reminder, this isn't a deep look at every Spiderweb Software game. I have a lot to cover, and I haven't even played some of these games, although I do plan on reviewing more Spiderweb games. In Exile, you play as a character that is banished to an underground world called Exile. This is a place where rejects and undesirables are placed. It's for characters that aren't wanted by the surface world, and you are banished here, and it's up to you to figure out how you will traverse this world. Get a party together and get ready for some tactical battles. I started off with a remake of an earlier Spiderweb game called Nethergate. After that, Geneforge, which was released in 2001 and was my second exposure to Jeff's games. But looking back, you can see Spiderweb's formula. Turn-based RPGs where you find a party or create a party. The atmosphere isn't presented through state-of-the-art graphics or a top-notch soundtrack. It's through dialogue and how the game explains the world. I explained this in my Geneforge review. Jeff is a very descriptive writer. You'll read vivid descriptions of the areas you visit, and not only that, when you're talking to people, you will see text explaining their mannerisms and movements. You might run into someone, and while you're talking to them, the game will describe how they look, or what are they doing at the time of your discussion. You'll also read how the area you entered just got to the way it is now, how it looks, and some other things. This really helps bring the game to life. It paints a picture in your head. Good dialogue and world building can make up for the lack of presentation. I'm going to share an example of that descriptive text. This is describing one of the areas in Geneforge, and I quote, "This once was a happy forest. The industrious serviles have been very busy here over the last century or so, cutting down the wood for their fires and their homes. The forest is quiet now, however, and there are no serviles to be seen. It's very quiet. In fact, there is almost no sound at all. The noises of the birds and insects are strangely muted. Though there is no actual noise, there is something in the air, an indefinable presence, constantly itching at the back of your mind. Thoughts fly through the air around you, constantly intruding on your thoughts. It's not an unfamiliar feeling. You have experienced this before. You are in the presence of the Velish. Quite a few of them. Velish were created by the Shapers to communicate and to sense things. They are highly magical creatures, though frail. It would seem that a number of them have occupied this wood, and their minds are linked." Back in 2015, I won a Steam gift contest, and it was for Nethergate Resurrection. And I can admit, when I first saw the game, the presentation turned me off, and I ignored it for several months. Then I decided to play it, and I realized I was a dumb fuck for ignoring their games because of how they look. Nethergate Resurrection is an interesting title, and I love the setting. You can either play as the Celts or the Romans, and each side has their own story. The Celts have been under the rule of the Roman Empire, and there's a rebellion going on, and you start off in the village of Nethergate. If you play as the Romans, you start off as a low-ranking party, and you start off in the Shadow Valley Fort. The Romans are great fighters, but they lack the skills needed to be good druids. On the other hand, the Celts, they can use their skills to master the druid skills. It's another name for magic. I've put over 40 hours into this game on and off over the past couple of years, and I do plan on going back and beating it so I can do a proper review. It was my first experience with Spiderweb software, and I think the setting is interesting. I also like the little sketches you see in their earlier games. It's not a big budget production, but I thought it was kinda unique and it gave it their own little touch. Now, if I had to pick one series to recommend to anyone interested in Spiderweb software, I would pick the Geneforge Saga. It's one of my favorite role-playing games. It's really unique. You are a god in this game. You can create and control different creatures, and this is what makes up your party if you choose to follow this path, and I recommend doing that. The story is very well written. Each area gets its own descriptive text about what it was, what it turned into, and what's going on in that area when you visit it. I reviewed this game, so if you want to check it out, the link will be in the description. But it's a saga worth checking out. Trying to find out the secrets of the island, how you ended up in it, how you control all these different creatures, how they got there, what's going on, and the conflict between the different factions and how you deal with it. And the game's writing was convincing enough to get me to change sides halfway through the game, and that's not an easy thing to do. I call this the Geneforge Saga because even though I'm only talking about the first game, and you'll see footage from that, there are 5 parts in this series. I'm halfway through part 2, and I can tell you it's worth it. Look past the presentation, and you will find deep lore and interesting stories. And that's a recurring theme with Spiderweb software. Geneforge, Avedon, Avernum, and Exile. They all have multiple parts. And by the way, Avernum is a remake of Exile. I picked a good time to make this video. Recently, Spiderweb Software's first Kickstarter ended and it was a success. I'm all for new CRPGs, and I usually don't trust Kickstarters or crowdfunding services, but it all depends on the individuals involved. Jeff has been making and publishing his games for over 20 years, so I know this game is gonna get made, and I hope it's good. One thing that I'm happy to hear is that he is addressing a certain complaint you often see. One of his stretch goals was to have professional sound design for Queen's Wish the Conqueror. And I hope this includes a full soundtrack. That stretch goal was 100K and they got close. They made 98,000, so I hope they followed through with it. It will definitely make their games more appealing, and not that it has to cater to the mainstream or anyone else. I know that's never going to happen, and I hope it stays that way. I like the fact that they appeal to that niche CRPG fan base, but better presentation can only help your game and bring new players in. If you like RPGs that are turn-based, have deep stories, and have multiple parts, you should look at Spiderweb Software and their video games. Don't be fooled by the presentation. You can get these games for cheap, especially on sale, and you're in for a long time. So get ready to get pulled into some of the most interesting worlds I've seen in any RPG. I suggest starting out with the Geneforge Saga. 24 years. That's how long Jeff has been developing games, and he still runs Spiderweb Software with his wife, and he's always stuck to a certain style. He could have went to another company. He's a good writer, and I'm sure someone would have hired him, and that's not a bad thing, but I'm happy to see him working on his own and staying independent. I'm looking forward to his next game, and if there's any piece of advice I can give him, it's this. Now that you have a successful Kickstarter, your game is going to have to look a bit better than your last one. The presentation has to be a bit better than your earlier games. I could care less about graphics. As long as it's an interesting game, I'm ready for it. But it's different now, and since you got funded, hopefully you'll have the extra funds to get some professional sound design or maybe a bit better artwork. But either way, I'm going to play it. This is just general advice to try and bring new players in, since I know you have to keep a profit to stay alive, and hopefully make more games and another Saga. Maybe this is that next one. Thank you for watching. If you want to leave a comment, go ahead. You know how to get into contact with me. Have a great day.